Our last fallacy of presumption is a fallacy called begging the question. And the fallacy of begging the question works by assuming in one of the premises or more than one of the premises information that is as contentious, as unacceptable to the consumer of the argument as the conclusion itself. So in order for an argument to actually be successful, somebody has to agree with you or recognize or accept your assumptions as likely to be true, and then follow the structure of the argument to go from the truth of those assumptions to the conclusion itself. However, right, they usually don't believe in the conclusion when they get your argument. And so if you assume something that is as hard for them to believe as the conclusion itself, you commit the fallacy of begging the question. So there are a number of different ways that you can commit the fallacy of begging the question, or under its Latin name, petitio principii. President George W. Bush was great at begging the question fallacies. And so I use his quotes as illustrations for every way that we talk about for begging the question. The first one, you can just implicitly assume a premise. So your argument really depends upon a bit of information, but in order to avoid calling attention to that information, in order to avoid people going like, hey, that's a contentious assumption, I can't follow that to the conclusion, you implicitly assume it. You don't actually state it. So you hope that your argument just convinces the reader because they don't take the time to analyze and see that you're assuming something that they don't accept. So George W. Bush did this when he tried to argue that people should get rid of Social Security. So he said Social Security is really a tax, hence it should be eliminated. Implicit in this argument is the idea that if something's a tax, it should be eliminated. Right? But somebody who likes Social Security, they're not going to agree to that premise in all likelihood. They'll go, yeah, Social Security is a tax. That tax provides me with this benefit. I like this benefit, hence the tax is fine. Taxes shouldn't just be eliminated because they're taxes. So those people are people for whom this argument begs the question. Another way that you can commit the fallacy of begging the question is by assuming your conclusion. But in order to keep people from recognizing that you're just assuming what you're trying to prove, you assume it in altered phraseology. So you say it in a way that's slightly different from the way it's stated in your conclusion. And then if people don't notice that you've just said the conclusion in different phrasing, they may not object to the argument. They may be convinced by it. So again, George W. Bush is a nice example of this. The reason I keep insisting there was a relationship between Iraq and Saddam and Al-Qaeda is because there was a relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. Well, this isn't an argument that anybody who was skeptical of that connection is going to accept, because all he's done is eliminate Saddam in the premise in order to conclude all three in the conclusion. So again, begging the question by assuming something that's as contentious as the conclusion itself in the context of the argument. The final version that we want to look at is where you commit the fallacy of begging the question by sneaking your assumption into a longer passage. Here, the idea is if you have a longer passage, people's working memory is going to get taxed. And because their working memory is taxed, they may not notice in the context of this larger passage that one of the assumptions that you make is in fact the same thing as the conclusion. And again, George W. Bush provides us with a lovely example of this. As a matter of fact, this is a global effort. So there's this conclusion. Right? We're facing a group of folks who have such hatred and hurt, they'll strike anywhere and with any means. And that's why it's essential we have strong alliances. And we do. So if we don't notice during the course of this longer passage that all he's really doing in the end is just asserting that we have strong alliances, the equivalent of it's a global effort, then we won't really realize that if we didn't accept there was a global effort, we don't really believe that there are strong alliances. Our next set of fallacies are fallacies of ambiguity. And here we have a word or a phrase or a whole sentence that is ambiguous, and the argument trades on that ambiguity. It substitutes one meaning for another meaning in order to seem to establish the conclusion from the premises. The first one we want to look at oftentimes is just called equivocation, but it's not really equivocation that's the problem. It's equating two things that aren't the same, or a false equivocation. So 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's an equivocation. It says these two things are the same. Perfectly fine. 2 plus 2 equals 5. That's a false equivocation, not the same at all. And so fallacies of equivocation or false equivocation, they switch the meanings of terms that don't have the same meaning anymore, but pretend that they do. So here's an example. All right? I tell you, jumbo shrimp are impossible objects. In order to be jumbo, you got to be huge. In order to be a shrimp, you got to be really small. But you can't be both huge and very small. This kind of argument is an argument that you would in fact find in all of Plato's dialogues almost. Plato didn't really understand these kinds of relationships. Right? So jumbo isn't just a size that's independent of what it is, of the object itself. Right? Jumbo is large relative to other members of that class. So a jumbo jet is a big jet. A jumbo shrimp is a big shrimp. So you can be big for a shrimp without being big simpliciter. And this is what Plato really kind of never gets a hold of in many of these arguments. So we're using jumbo, we're using shrimp, right? But we're not using them in the same context. We're assuming that jumbo just means huge simpliciter, when in fact it is huge for a shrimp in the context of this argument. And likewise, shrimp we're using is very small, but it's not very small simpliciter. It's very small relative to other objects. Finally, we have amphiboly. And amphiboly is a fallacy of ambiguity that doesn't turn on a word or a phrase being used with two different meanings. It turns on an entire sentence that can be understood in one or two, three different ways. And it equates one way with another way in order to seem to derive the conclusion. So for example, suppose in your course evaluations you wrote out, there ain't no way that you would recommend this course to other students. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I've got to go up for tenure now. I really got to nip this in the bud. I got to make it look like it's good. And so I write this up and I say the student clearly, uses two negatives. But of course, it's not the case that it's not the case. It's an affirmative. And so the student is really saying they would recommend this course. That's an amphiboly. The sentence itself can be understood in two different ways. In ordinary language, right, we kind of use multiple negations to sort of pound on the table to stress just how negative we think it is. So there ain't no way, no how, no sir, I would recommend this course. Right? That's just a way of saying no, no, no. Right? Definitely not. However, if you're an aficionado of the Oxford English Dictionary or you're a grammarian, right, then two negatives is the denial of the sentence, and hence it's an affirmation. And so there are these two different meanings. You mean very negative. I construe your meaning as an affirmative. And so I commit the fallacy of amphiboly. I have a whole sentence. The sentence is ambiguous between two different ways of understanding those double negatives. I use the way that favors me, even though you intended it in the way that is a denial.